Once we've established an approximate era of construction based on a building's appearance, we then begin to delve into archival primary source documents. The resources I'm discussing tonight are not the only resources we use, but they are the main ones. One of the most useful resources are the Historic Department of Buildings files kept at the Municipal Archives, which contain all Historic Department of Buildings permits that date to 1865, when the department was created. These include permits for new building construction, for alterations, demolitions, and certificates of occupancies for buildings. This is wonderful, but at the same time might be limiting because, as we've already discussed, there are a number of row houses and early tenement buildings in the neighborhood that date back earlier than 1865. For those buildings, the files might turn up later alteration permits, but would not allow us to discern an original date of construction of the building. But for buildings that we know were constructed post-1865, we can hope to find an original construction permit in this file. This building's footprint is a creative interpretation of the dumbbell shape, which means we can say with near certainty that it was constructed between 1879 and 1901. And indeed, the permit for new construction does indicate that it was constructed in 1891 by Kurtzer and Roll Architects. Besides date and architect, the new building permit also gives us such information as original owner, building materials, dimensions, use, and cost. Sometimes the building files contain illustrations, such as original building blueprints or plot diagrams for alterations, such as in the case of this 1938 alteration for the Amato Opera Building at 319 Bowery. Even though the files might be limited for buildings constructed prior to 1865, when the Department of Buildings was created, in many cases the later alteration permits are actually more useful for our purposes. The Mesrich Synagogue on East 6th Street between 1st Avenue and Avenue A is one such case. It was altered from a dwelling to a synagogue in 1910 for the Polish Orthodox construction Anshe Mesrich, as we can see in the alteration permit. This building is known as a tenement synagogue because it fits into a narrow lot normally used for residences. These types of religious structures are typical of this neighborhood and were often built or altered by small congregations who could not afford to construct larger houses of worship. Another similar structure is on East 7th Street between 1st Avenue and Avenue A. It was altered from a row house to the Hungarian Reformed Church in 1903. But not all tenement churches or synagogues resulted from alterations. This building, originally constructed for St. Elizabeth of Hungary in 1891, was constructed from the ground up as a church. Without seeing the building file, it would have been difficult for us to have made this distinction. While building files are useful in many ways, they are also limiting for a number of reasons. First, they don't allow us to discern original dates of construction or ownership of buildings constructed before 1865, when the Department of Buildings was created. Moreover, they don't give us any idea how the building may have looked. For this, we have to turn to historic photos. This is a great example of a building for which historic photos would be helpful to understand what it may have looked like. It was originally built as the Welsh Congregational Church sometime in the early 1850s. Unfortunately, it has been refaced, allowing us few clues as to its original appearance. Fortunately for us, the city went about photographing every building in all 5 boroughs of the city in the years between 1939 and 1941. These photos are known commonly as tax photos and are kept at the municipal archives on microfilm for public viewing. They are especially helpful for buildings like this, which have undergone post-1940s alterations. The tax photos help us peel back the layers of stucco to see what exists underneath. To find photos from other years, we turn to the collections of the New York Historical Society and the New York Public Library, to name a few. These 2 photos from the New York Public Library show the building in 1926 on the right and in 1934 on the left. The New York Public Library has digitized a wealth of photos from their collection, which can be accessed through their website. Historic photos also help us understand the origins of some of the buildings we walk by every day and might not even notice. For instance, this photo from the 1930s shows 2nd Avenue when it was the center of the Yiddish Rialto and was lined with theaters. While few actual theaters are active today, the buildings that once housed them still do exist. For instance, at the corner of 1st Street, which was once the Woolworth Theater, constructed in 1913, now houses the Mars Bar. Further up the street, we can find many other theaters that have since been decommissioned. The Lowe's Commodore Theater between 6th and 7th Streets, which was constructed in 1925, is now home to the Emigrant Savings Bank. Finally, photos also show us what once existed in the neighborhood and is no longer there. This 1928 photo shows the Baptist Tabernacle building in the center of the block between 10th and 11th Streets on 2nd Avenue, just across from St. Mark's Church in the Bowery. The Tabernacle was constructed in 1850. In 1929, the building was replaced by the Art Deco Warren Hall, which allows us a little glimpse into its past by the inscription over the main entranceway, which now reads Baptist Tabernacle. Building files and historic photos tell us a great deal, but still do not allow us to date buildings that predate the Department of Buildings. For that, we turn to historic maps and compare building footprints from year to year to help us narrow down a window of time during which we think a building may have first appeared. The New York Public Library has an incredible collection of historic tax maps, some of which contain a great wealth of detail. Many of these maps are online, but if you haven't visited their map room in person, you should definitely visit just to see it. The earliest of these very detailed lot-by-lot maps in their collection dates from 1853, which you can see here for 2 blocks just south of Tompkins Square Park, which was actually one of the later portions of the neighborhood to develop. If we compare this with a map from just 1 decade later, we can see what a crucial period of development the 1850s and 60s were for these blocks, which still contain a wealth of pre-law tenements dating from this time. These maps are also color-coded by material. Pink means masonry, yellow means wood, and green means various uses, such as stables or manufacturing. These maps are originally created for fire insurance purposes, so the color coding and symbols help document degree of hazard. One of my favorite things about them is how clearly you can see the original tea rooms, which were wooden porches often built on the back of Greek Revival row houses. On this 1899 map of the same blocks, we can see that old law tenements have replaced some of the earlier buildings. The map from 1903 has an incredibly rich detail, especially on the commercial blocks, where the types of businesses have been recorded. Finally, tax assessment records help us date buildings for which we cannot find original new building permits, most often because the buildings predate the 1865 formation of the Department of Buildings. Tax assessment records essentially list the assessed value of every lot on a block in a single year. There exists a record for almost every year in the 19th century. Comparing them to one another helps us date early buildings. Here is an example of a tax assessment record from the year 1846 for the block front we're on right now, which I know is a favorite block among many in the neighborhood for its level of historic intactness. You'll see that the title of this record says North Side of 10th Street at Avenue B. Just imagine that every row under this header represents a different building on the block, moving west from Avenue B to A. Every column gives us information about that specific lot. The first column tells us the owner of the lot in that year. The second column is what exists on the lot. For instance, it may say LV for vacant land or LH for land with house. We can see that the buildings closer to Avenue A, which are 293 to 309 East 10th Street, have been constructed by this time, while much of the rest of the block was still undeveloped. Sometimes tax records might also tell us that a house was unfinished in this year. And finally, the column at the end will give us the assessed value of the property at that time. You'll notice that the lots with houses have much higher assessed values than those without. Comparing these tax assessment records from year to year helps us understand how the block developed in a larger context. Utilizing tax records has allowed us to date a staggering number of early row houses in the East Village. So why this whole effort? We're doing this first and foremost to protect our history and to ensure that new development in the East Village is contextual with its surroundings. Despite its rich architectural and cultural history, only one small historic district and 26 individual buildings receive protection from the Landmarks Preservation Commission. That means 98% of the neighborhood remains vulnerable to alterations and demolition. Arguably, the greatest oversight on the part of the city is that despite the fact that tenements are the neighborhood's dominant architectural typology, except for one new law tenement within the boundaries of the St. Mark's Historic District, not a single other East Village tenement is protected under the regulations of the Landmarks Preservation Commission. So far, we have identified over 400 surviving and intact buildings that were constructed as pre-law tenements, over 400 that were built as old law tenements, and over 200 new law tenements. These buildings are the lifeblood of this neighborhood and contain a wealth of playful architectural detail worthy of protection. Moreover, despite the fact that the neighborhood housed the largest Jewish population in the world around the turn of the century, only 2 buildings connected to this Jewish history are protected. These are the Yiddish Art Theater at 189 2nd Avenue and the Beth Hamadrash Haggadah Synagogue at 242 East 7th Street. This leaves buildings like the Congregation Mezrich Synagogue at 415 East 6th Street, which is the neighborhood's last operating tenement synagogue, vulnerable to alteration and demolition. The beautifully preserved community synagogue, shown on the upper right, is often believed to have kick-started the transformation of the neighborhood to the Jewish Lower East Side in 1904, when it was known as the German Evangelical Lutheran Church of St. Mark, and nearly 1,000 of its congregants were lost in the sinking of the General Slocum boat, leading to the fleeing of many of the remaining Germans from the neighborhood. Many historians consider this to have been the worst tragedy in the history of New York before 9/11. Several other immigrant groups also remain underrepresented among landmarks in this neighborhood, but that is definitely a larger discussion for another day. The Landmarks Preservation Commission has also yet to recognize the significance of the East Village's waterfront as the center of New York's shipbuilding industry for decades in the mid-19th century. By 1840, shipyards extended up this part of the East River coast in practically an unbroken line. Yet not a single building with a direct connection to this history has been landmarked. This leaves buildings such as 326 and 328 East 4th Street vulnerable to demolition. These buildings were part of the first wave of development in the neighborhood and developed by the builder of the first steamship ever to cross the Atlantic. A developer currently has plans to substantially alter them. And though a multitude of early row houses survive in the neighborhood, only a small handful of them are protected as landmarks. These are the earliest buildings in the East Village, and many of them date to the early 1830s and 1840s. And while we're all familiar with the types of buildings we have seen constructed in the past few years, which fail to relate in any way to the beautiful architectural and cultural heritage of this neighborhood, we hope that the report we produce, which will be based on our research and made public within the next year, helps to start a neighborhood-wide conversation for how to ensure that we don't lose sight of our past forever. Thank you all so much for coming.